does get a card from she wouldn't get one. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and friends. For those of you who don't know me, my name's David Martin. I'm Treasurer of the Friends. Apologies from 3 of my trustee colleagues who are recovering from medical procedures under advice from their respective doctors to not to venture out on a cold evening. But welcome to you all. Welcome to the friends who are here in person. Welcome to those who are going to be viewing it online tonight on YouTube, and welcome to those YouTube viewers who look upon us in the months to come. A couple of small housekeeping matters. Please make sure your phones are turned off, although Stephen here says he can't get a signal down here, so maybe nobody will. And we're not expecting a fire alarm practice or test tonight, so if it goes off for real, fire escape is here, and of course the way you came in. A couple of notices about forthcoming meetings before I introduce Stephen. Here at Covent Garden, 11th of March, I'm afraid this is now fully booked. The next meeting here is fully booked, but you can add your name to the waiting list online. April, 15th of April, please, if you're interested, this hasn't been advertised, but you can go on the website, have a look at it. Open Access Rail, a talk by Martin Gilbert. If you wish to come, please book online, either through the website or by email. 2 talks coming up at the Acton Depot. Thursday, 21st of March. I'm afraid that is now fully booked, and the waiting list is full. Thursday, 25th of April, Unfulfilled Promises, the abortive Northern Line extensions. Again, if you wish to, you can book for that. Please do that through the website or by email. And now, without further ado, I would love to introduce our tonight's speaker, Stephen Fielding. He's going to talk about the history of the Kempton Park Pumping Station. Stephen has been an active volunteer at Kempton Park Steam Museum since 2008. He's involved in most areas of the museum, including being one of the engine drivers, one of the events organisers, and responsible for marketing. Since 2022, he's served as a trustee. Stephen has undertaken a significant historical research over the years to learn more about the mighty steam engines and the role they play in the water supply of London. Stephen's day job is in historic building conservation, get it right? Working for Habitats and Heritage in East Twickenham. He is also very passionate about the history of London's transport. So, a very, very warm welcome to Stephen. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the introduction. Can everybody hear me okay? Oh, that's good. That's working. So good evening, everybody. My name is Stephen Fielding. I'm a volunteer and trustee at Kempton Steam Museum in South West London. Just show of hands, has anybody heard of the museum before? Oh, that's pretty impressive, actually. How many of you have been? Oh, that is impressive, actually. When I normally give these talks, nobody's been, actually, so that's good. But for those of you who've not been, I'm hoping you're going to learn a lot about the museum today, Kempton Park Pumping Station, where the museum is located, and hopefully about London's water supply. Now, I'm a bit concerned by all the hands that went up, actually, with the next question I was going to ask. I was going to ask, how many of you can confidently say that you know where your drinking water comes from, the process it goes through, and how it gets to your home? Now, I can see somebody from a couple of the museums we're affiliated with, so I'm not going to ask them to answer that. But a show of hands of people who could confidently say that. So there's fewer hands have gone up there. Now, it's interesting because every day, each and every one of us in this room consumes, on average, 145 litres of the stuff. Yet, not all of us can say where it comes from. It's one of those mysteries. We only tend to question it when it goes wrong. So I'm hoping during during this talk I'm going to tell you about how you receive your water before going on to the history about how the water supply system evolved. So for those of you who don't know how you get your water, this diagram along the top here and these photographs hopefully illustrate the system. So most of London's water comes from the River Thames. And the particular example I'm showing you on the screen is relevant to the very location we're standing in right now, because Kempton Park Pumping Station supplies water to central London. So the water that's coming out the taps in this very museum has likely come from the museum that I'm going to talk about in just a moment. Before I get going, this is how the system works. So the water gets taken out of the River Thames in Staines or at Laleham. It then gets pumped into a large storage reservoir. The one in the example is the Queen Mary Reservoir, which is so large that you can fit the entire city of London inside it with a moat all the way around. It's that big. When it was installed in 1925, it had enough water in it for the whole of London for 22 days. Now that number has gone down slightly over the decades because we now consume a lot more water per head than we were in the 1920s. But nevertheless, there's still a huge amount of water in there. Now the storage reservoir does two things. It's the first stage of the settlement process for water, and it's also London's battery backup. So when we tend to have hosepipe bans in the summer months, that's because water authorities like Thames Water have been told to take no more water out of the River Thames. The level has fallen to a certain level. We're totally reliant on what's been stored up during the rainy season. But from the reservoir, the water then flows to the treatment works. And I'm going to talk about Kempton Park this evening. So this is the example. It goes into the primary filter house at Kempton, where the coarse bacteria are filtered out of the system. It then passes into the slow sound filter beds, which I will talk about a bit later on, before going into the pumping station for distribution into the water mains that run all across London to high level ground in the north of London on hilly ground. And the example of the given here is Bishop's Wood covered reservoir. And to get the water from the River Thames to the pumping station takes about 2 weeks. To get it from the pumping station to the service reservoir takes about 10 hours. So when you turn your tap on, that water's been on a 2-week, 10-hour journey. And for the previous 10 hours, it's been in total darkness as well to prevent any bacterial growth. So hopefully you now know where you get your drinking water from. And as I say, it's very good to be here this evening because this is where Kempton Park actually supplies its water to. So for those of you who have not been to Kempton Park Pumping Station or Kempton Steam Museum, this is a picture of our museum, the glorious new engine house at Kempton Park. If any of you have driven down the A316 towards the M3 motorway, you will have almost certainly passed it. And we did used to say that it was the building opposite the one with the cows on the roof, for those of you who might remember the dairy that had the cows on the roof, which was sadly taken down a few years ago. So we're up here somewhere. The museum is down there, not far from Heathrow Airport, just on the A316 as it leaves London. And inside the building are two of the largest steam engines of their type in the world. And in fact, we do say that that's probably the largest working steam engine in the world, though we can't actually prove it because it's very difficult to measure the sizes of steam engines because they vary considerably. But I think it's probably a contender. That engine is called the Sir William Prescott steam engine. And it was installed in 1928. And it pumped London's drinking water from 1929 right through until 1980 when it was decommissioned. And if you can make out the figures in white, they are people. And in fact, that guy there, he's about 6'2". So it just gives you the height from the engine from the base to the top, 62 feet. And it weighs about 800 tons. And it's very similar in size and design to the engines that were on board the Titanic. So in fact, we get a lot of film crews in there pretending that that is the Titanic's engine. And in fact, we joke that that engine's probably run more as Titanic's engine than Titanic's engines ran as themselves now. And of course, that engine isn't on its own in there. There are two engines. The engine I just showed you is this one on the left. The one opposite, the Lady Bessie Prescott engine. Sir William and Lady Bessie, they're husband and wife. Sir William was the chairman of the Metropolitan Water Board, and I'll talk a bit about that organisation a bit later. And this is the entire works as it appeared in 1929 before the elevated motorway was put under its nose and completely ruined the view forever. And you can see at the back there is another pumping station as well. So the actual waterworks itself has been functioning since 1906 non-stop. but originally all the pumping operations went on inside this building. Where our museum now is, that's the new kid on the block, and in fact it remains the newest building on the site, yet it has the oldest equipment inside it. And this is the area that Kempton Park Pumping Station supplied, or continues to supply, I should say. The whole works is still fully active except what is inside the museum building at the front there. So in its heyday, it supplied about 14% of London's water. So about 1 in 7 people in London relied every day on the works for their drinking water. It pumped about 50 million gallons of water per day. London consumed 300 in those days. The distribution included the West End, the East End, the City of London, and a lot of the industrial areas of the west of London, including Western Avenue, the Great West Road, the Guinness Brewery at Park Royal. So if you were ever drinking a pint of Guinness from the Park Royal Brewery in the 60s or 70s, you were drinking water that potentially come from Kempton Park Pumping Station. And I thought I'd add that one in as well. You might be familiar with that one. So the pumping station, in its height, had 3 engine houses of different eras, the museum being the last and the latter one. And there were 15 steam engines at its height, throbbing away every day, day and night, to keep London's taps running. The main source of water for the works is the River Thames, and it had 180 employees back in the day. I can say that sometimes us volunteers outnumber the number of staff that are on duty there at the waterworks now. So I'm going to give you a history lesson now. We're going to go back to the 16th century. And I'm going to talk a bit about how London's water supply infrastructure evolved over the centuries. And if you ever tell the story of London's water supply, you tend to have to start with this man here, Sir Hugh Middleton. He was a citizen and goldsmith of London. And the reason we're interested in him was because he was the guy who championed the construction of the new river, which brought clean water from Chadwell Spring in Hertfordshire down into London. Now, since antiquity, people had known that drinking dirty water probably wasn't good for you. And as time progressed and London started to grow, the River Thames started to become contaminated. So people thought that perhaps it'd be good if we got a clean source of water. So that's where Hugh Middleton came in. So he built the new river, 42 miles long, carrying the water all the way from Hertfordshire, near Amwell, all the way down into Clerkenwell. Now, it's amazing to think that when it started in 1608, it was only completed 4 years later, this entire project. And it cost £18,000, which, if you account for inflation, is now £4 million in today's money. And once it started operating, the new river company was established to maintain it and to supply the water that was being brought down from Hertfordshire. And the new river company was one of the 8 private water companies that would operate over the next 300 years, supplying London with its drinking water. This is where the new river begins now. This place is called New Gauge, and this is where the new river taps into the River Lee in Hertfordshire. Now, originally, the water actually came from a spring called Chadwell Spring in near Amwell. But they decided that that wasn't quite enough to supply the new river, so they tapped it into the River Lee to supplement the supply. But this is where the new river originally started. And if you go to Amwell, there is a monument to Sir Hugh Middleton in the middle of the river. And this is the monument here, shown in 1952, looking rather smart, but it's looking a bit tired now. And engraved on the side in Latin, I won't read it in Latin, it says, "An immortal work, since men cannot more nearly imitate the deity than in bestowing health. Sir Hugh Middleton brought clean water to London," and of course, that's what we rely on for survival. And this is the new river as it weaves its way down in towards London. And you can see along the route there are these little pumping stations that take water out of wells underground and they pump it into the river, which is a gravity flow all the way into London. And if you get the opportunity to walk along the New River Path, I can recommend it. It is a beautiful walk. And this is where the New River originally terminated. This is the round pond at New Riverhead in Clerkenwell. Now, sadly, that's all gone now, but that was where it ended. And that's where the New River Company set up their headquarters. And it was the headquarters of Thames Water until the 1990s. But now the New River terminates a bit further north in Stoke Newington. But we still rely on it today for a considerable portion of London's drinking water, 300 years after it was built. So I'm going to move a bit further forward now to the 19th century, because not a lot happened in the 17th and 18th. But as the 19th century commenced and wore on, London became denser and denser. Between 1801 and 1891, London's population increased fivefold, went from about 1 million up to 5.5 million, which was a considerable increase when you consider that the infrastructure and all the services didn't grow as fast. And of course, if you put a lot of people in a small space, you tend to get disease. And this is actually me on my way to work this morning, but I do believe it's death rowing down the River Thames. And you can see this cartoon, which was published in the 1850s, shows London Bridge and St Paul's Cathedral in the background, and you can see that the River Thames is a state. There's dead animals floating around and all sorts of nasty stuff. And people had realised for quite some time that perhaps it wasn't the best thing to be drinking this water. And this pamphlet was published in 1827 called The Dolphin, or the Grand Junction Nuisance. The Grand Junction Waterworks Company was one of the 8 private water companies that supplied London with its drinking water. And this is their waterworks at Chelsea. That there is their intake in the River Thames. They just sucked the water straight out of the Thames in Chelsea and then pumped it into the pipes without filtering it, just straight out of the River Thames. That there is a sewer. And that is the Chelsea Hospital. So the sewage is pouring out into the River Thames and it's wrapping itself around their intake, and then they're sucking it back in and pumping it back into your home again. So it was a completely sort of closed loop. And people thought that perhaps that's not a good idea, and that might explain why a lot of people are getting unwell when they're drinking Grand Junction water. So people have started to try and raise awareness to this problem, that something should be done to clean up London's drinking water. And this cartoon from a year later shows a woman looking under a microscope or a looking glass at what's inside the water. You can see all these nasties swimming around and claiming that's what's inside your drinking water, the monster soup commonly called Thames water, not to be confused with the modern company. So in 1829, this guy came along, James Simpson, and we think of him as being sort of the modern-day Middleton, Sir Hugh Middleton, because he was the first engineer to implement the slow sand filter bed at a waterworks in London. Prior to him coming along, all of the waterworks companies, they used to just suck the water out of the Thames, like they did at the Dolphin, and put it straight into supply. But he'd observed in other industries, in other places in the country, that they started to filter the water and it had benefits. So he got the Chelsea and eventually the Lambeth Waterworks Company to install slow sand filter beds at their waterworks. And they started to find that the purity of the water increased and that people tended to not get quite as unwell when they were drinking the filtered water, though they were still drawing water out of the very polluted River Thames. So the very early filters probably had a negligible effect, but it was significant. And this photograph on the left here is of Kew Bridge Pumping Station in Brentford, and you can see one of the slow sand filter beds being relayed. It's a very simple system. The filter bed relies on various layers of sand, gravel, shingle and brick. The water goes in at the top, works its way through the sand, the gravel and the brick, and as it comes out at the bottom, it is then safe to drink. Now, when James Simpson installed these beds, he thought he was installing a mechanical filter, but actually he was installing a mechanical and biological filter without realising it, because what happens is good bacteria get stuck on the surface and they eat the bad bacteria. So on the surface of the bed you've got this war going on with all the bad bacteria being eaten, and then all the large stuff is being just trapped by the sand and it's not allowed through. And the way they work is every few weeks they drain them, skim the top layer of sand off, put a new layer of sand on top, and then get the filter going again. A majority of London's drinking water, still to this very day, relies on slow sand filter beds and has done for over 150 years now. Now, this man was pioneering because he installed slow sand filter beds at the Lambeth Waterworks in 1829, but it would take 30 years before it was in law to actually do this, and they were the only water company to install filters, which of course led to several issues that we now know about, one of them being cholera. Now, these figures here show how many people died from cholera during the 19th century. So you can see the first wave of cholera struck London in 1831, killing 6,000 people. Again in 1848, killing a further 14,000. Third one in 1853, killing 10,700. And the last outbreak in 1866 killed 6,000 people. And the last outbreak was actually caused by a water company not following the law, not filtering the water properly, and pumping sewage effectively into people's pipes, because they did not follow Acts of Parliament that followed these outbreaks. Now, at the time of the first waves of cholera, nobody knew how cholera was spread. People had an idea that contaminated water wasn't good for you, hence why so many people in the previous centuries have spent time trying to bring in clean water to London. But nobody thought cholera was spread in water. They thought it was an airborne disease. They called it the miasma. They believed that if you breathed the foul air of London, you would catch cholera. But this guy, John Snow, came along and said, I don't believe any of that. I think it's a waterborne disease. But nobody would believe him. So he set about trying to prove his point. He was living in Soho in the 1850s, and he decided to go round and plot all of the houses in the Soho area where people had got cholera, because he identified that there was a concentration of people getting cholera in Soho. And he discovered that if people were getting cholera by breathing in bad air, why were people living next door to each other not necessarily getting cholera? Why were not all the brewery workers getting cholera? Because they were all drinking beer, purified water. And he came to the conclusion that in the centre of all of the outbreaks was a water pump. And he petitioned the local authorities to remove the pump handle from the water pump, because he was convinced that that was the source of the cholera in the area. And they removed the handle, and the cases went away. But even then, people still wouldn't believe him. But there was one anomaly, because John Snow had discovered that somebody in Hampstead, far away from London, had got, or the London as it then was, had got cholera, until he found out that that person once lived in Broad Street, in the centre of Soho, where the water pump was, and she'd taken a liking to the taste of the water. So every so often she'd have a jug of the water from the Broad Street pump taken up to her home, and that's how she'd got cholera. But by taking off the handle in Broad Street, he managed to isolate the cholera in the area, and they later discovered that the source of the water pump had broken through like a cesspit wall, and apparently a child that had had cholera, their clothing was in the cesspit, and they believe that's how it had got into the water pump water. But it wasn't until after he died that anybody believed that cholera was waterborne. In fact, it would take until the 1860s that anybody believed it was waterborne. Sadly, he died 4 years later, never being believed. And a pioneering chap was John Snow. He was one of the first people to use anaesthetics. And in fact, he gave anaesthetised Queen Victoria when she was giving birth. And it was only after that event did people then trust it as a form of surgery. I thought I'd use this map because I'm assuming most of you recognise it. Now, I mentioned that there were efforts going back as far as the 16th century to try and clean up London's water. Even though nobody thought cholera was being spread in the water, they had realised that it perhaps wasn't wise drinking cloudy water, and that the reason you got sick half an hour later was probably as a result of that. So the government passed the Metropolis Water Act in 1852. And what this act stipulated was that no water company in London was allowed to take drinking water out of the River Thames above that point, or below that point there. That's where Teddington Weir is located. So anywhere between Teddington Weir and the Thames estuary, you are not allowed to take drinking water, which stuffed organisations like the Grand Junction Waterworks Company, because they had their dolphin in the river at Chelsea. So they had to move their works down to Brentford, to Kew Bridge. And all the companies had to move their intakes down, which is why if you ever look at a map, an aerial view of London from the air, you'll notice that there is a concentration of reservoirs in this area. That's because they are all the other side of Teddington Weir. And that's the only section of the River Thames where you may take water out of the river. The Act of Parliament also stipulated that you must install slow sand filter beds in all of your waterworks. This is the first time that had been insisted upon. And they're all covered reservoirs, that's the reservoirs where the drinking water is being stored, must be covered over. But only if they were less than 5 miles from St Paul's Cathedral. So if they were further away from St Paul's Cathedral, you didn't have to bother putting a lid on the water systems. Now, not all of the companies followed those rules, and they had until 1855 to comply with them. But they were still breaking the rules well into the 1860s. And I mentioned that the last cholera outbreak happened in 1866. And that was as a result of the East London Waterworks Company not obeying the rules and managing to contaminate the water supply. Now, the East London Waterworks Company is also relevant to the Kempton Park Pumping Station story, because after that Act of Parliament, they moved to Sunbury. They moved their waterworks, or some of their pumping operations, from the River Lee to Kempton Park. And the reason they're related, if you look at the top here, you can see this is Kempton Steam Museum and the Kempton Park Pumping Station. This is the East London Waterworks Pumping Station at Hanworth Road. So even though they're distinct places and they were built about 30 years apart from one another, they are so close together that in latter years they were considered one big pumping station and waterworks site. This is the pumping station that you might have just seen in the bottom of the screen here. This is the Hanworth Road Pumping Station. It's built in a beautiful Italianate style with a tall standpipe tower. If any of you have been to the London Museum of Water and Steam at Brentford, Kew Pumping Station, they've got a similar arrangement. The way the system works is the water is pumped by engines inside the pumping station up a pipe that runs to the top of the tower. Then once it gets to the top of the tower, it then bends over and the water then rushes down the other side and into the water mains that travel underneath London to where the water's needed. And the beauty of that system is the engines are always pumping to the top of the tower. The pressure remains constant, despite how many taps might be on further down the line. And these are the beautiful beam engines that were installed in that pumping station for supplying the East End of London with its drinking water. And these engines, 3 of them were in there. They would suck the water in from the filters outside the building and then put the water into a 36-inch water main that ran 19 miles all the way over to Finsbury Park Reservoir. And this is a photograph inside that reservoir, which is a beautiful feat of Victorian engineering. It's still there under Finsbury Park to this day. If you go walking over there and all of a sudden you get to a load of boggy grass, you're walking on top of the reservoir. And the reason it's boggy is because the reservoir is sealed, so when it rains, the mud can't get rid of the water. Now, if any of you have seen the James Bond film Skyfall, you might remember a scene where a tube train bursts in through a tunnel. That was based on that reservoir. I don't know if they filmed any scenes with Daniel Craig running away from the tube train in there, but at least the CGI model is based on the Finsbury Park Reservoir. Now, I also mentioned the Hanworth Road Pumping Station because it's relevant to this poster here. It's the only time the waterworks had ever featured on an underground poster. And the reason it featured was because between 1912 and 1920, the tall standpipe tower was the turning point for the aerial derby. So there was an air race around London, starting and ending at Hendon. And planes would go around London, and this was one of the turning points. And you can see on this map here, it's telling you to go to the waterworks at Kempton Park to see one of the turning points, and then advises you how to travel there. So that's one of our few links with the London Transport Museum we have. So rolling on to the 20th century. Now, I mentioned that there were 8 private water companies in London. So I mentioned the Grand Junction Waterworks Company, the East London, the New River Company. By 1903, it got a bit silly having these 8 private companies. The areas that they supplied water to were no longer distinct. The East End of London, the City and the West End were all one big city. They weren't distinct anymore. There were no fields between Clerkenwell and Whitechapel. So the government at the time decided to municipalise the whole of London's water supply infrastructure by making the Metropolitan Water Board. And this is their coat of arms. In fact, if you look at the coat of arms, you might see that there are 8 water droplets. Each of those water droplets represents the 8 private water companies that made up the water board. Are there any Latin scholars in here? Anybody? Nobody's brave enough? Well, I'll let you know that along the bottom there, that's their motto. It roughly translates to, "And I caused it to rain upon one city." It's a story taken from the Old Testament, the Bible. On the left, we have Hygeia, the goddess of health, and on the right, Aquarius, the water bearer. Now, this is where their headquarters was based. This is New River Head. So you might remember earlier I showed you that round pond where the New River terminated. Well, they took over the New River Company's headquarters at New River Head, and about 15 years later they demolished the old Victorian buildings that were there, and they built this beautiful headquarters for themselves, which was completed in the 1920s and functioned as the headquarters for Thames Water right up until the 1990s, when it was sold for housing. This is the area that the Metropolitan Water Board covered from 1903 onwards. And by the 1930s, they managed 7,800 miles of water mains running underneath London, covering a population of 7.5 million people, an area of 540 square miles, and they were pumping on average about 300 million gallons per day. The three sources of London's water are the River Thames, the River Lee and Wells, and those percentages show you roughly how much water was taken, at least in the 1930s, from those three sources. But my understanding is there is more reliance on the River Thames these days than ever before. And this is where their most important waterworks sites were located. These are the Thames Valley Works. And slap bang in the middle is Kempton Park Pumping Station, Kempton Park Waterworks. That's the topic of the talk this evening. And you can see there are other works dotted around. So Hampton Waterworks, which supplies a lot of the south and the west end of London. Walton Waterworks, which supplies a lot of the south as well, and Croydon. Surbiton Works, which is now closed down. That's also known as Sieving Wells in Surbiton. That's where James Simpson installed some of his very early filter beds. And in fact, if you're going down the Portsmouth Road, you can see some of the remnants of those filter beds. And one of the largest reservoirs in London, the Queen Mary, which you may recall at the very beginning of the talk, I showed you the process of how water gets from the river to the tap. That's the reservoir that you can build the entire city of London inside. And that is the reservoir that supplies Kempton Park Works with water from the River Thames. So the Kempton Park Works, excluding the older Victorian bit, the Hamworth Roadworks that I showed you earlier with the tall standpipe tower, started operating in 1906, and this is the works from the air. If you ignore the building at the front here, that's where our museum now is. That wasn't built until the 1920s, but everything else you see in this picture has been functioning constantly since 1906 and still functions to this day, except for these two reservoirs. They stopped using those in the 1960s. If you look in the middle here, you can see the slow sand filter beds where London's water is being filtered at this very moment. And this is the original Kempton Park Works. So this is we call it the Lillishall Engine House. Now the land here was bought by the New River Company in the 1890s, but by the time they started to actually dig out the ground, the Metropolitan Water Board had come into being, and they finished all of the works. So the waterworks never functioned under the New River Company. It was only ever under the Metropolitan Water Board. And inside that building, they installed 5 Lillishall triple expansion steam engines in a row, which must have been quite a sight to see, to walk in and see these 5 engines in a row, all pumping away. And they built a pipeline which carries the water all the way from Kempton, up through Feltham, Hounslow, Heston, Hanwell, Greenford, Willesden, all the way to a reservoir at Cricklewood, where the water was then boosted at Cricklewood Pumping Station up to a reservoir at Fortis Green. And the way the system works is a gravity feed system. So Kempton and Cricklewood pump the water up to the highest ground they can manage, and then pipes then carry the water into central London and to the East End like so. So the water flows like that. These are the 8 Lancashire boilers that were put in to provide steam for those steam engines I just showed you. And in order to feed those boilers with coal, they built their own narrow gauge railway line to bring coal from a wharf from the River Thames at Hampton to the works at Kempton. And this is one of the 3 steam locomotives that work the line They were built by Kerr Stewart, and they were known as Sunbury, Kempton and Hampton. So they were named after the local places. But sadly, all three engines were scrapped in the 1940s when the railway line was ripped up. They then relied upon a standard gauge railway line bringing the coal in from the Shepperton branch of the South Western line. So this is where the museum starts to come into the story. So in the 1920s, as many of you may be aware, and after the First World War, London started to expand rapidly further and further into the countryside. And of course, with more and more people living in London, they needed more water. So the Kempton Park Works was decided that it wasn't fit for use, even though it was only 10 years old by this point. They needed more water. So just before the First World War, they decided they were going to expand the pumping station. They were going to put in a new waterworks there. But the war got in the way and it delayed plans. In the 1920s, the plans got pulled out of the drawers again, and they decided to build the new engine house where our museum now is. And this photograph shows it being constructed in 1927. In order to pump the vast volume of water that London required, they put in some of the largest, or the largest steam engines ever built in this country. And this photograph here shows one of our two triple expansion engines that we now preserve at the museum on blocks in the factory where they were built. They were made by Worthington Simpson in Newark-on-Trent. And the factory was not big enough to actually house the complete engines and pump units. So you can see that's the top of the engine. And this photograph here shows the pump units in a different part of the building because they just simply did not have the height in the erecting shop to put them both together. Now, all of the design work, the castings and the machining was all done by Worthington Simpson in Newark, but any of the steel forgings and the cast steel components, they were made by William Beardmore and Co. in Glasgow. And this photograph on the left here shows one of the pump chambers as it's just come out of the forge with one of the workers standing next to it, just to give you a sense of the scale of these machines. And you might notice that there's a chap standing there as well. So for any of you who've not been there, these engines are pretty big. And this photo here shows the engines being installed. So you can see this is the inside of our museum. The pumps for one of the engines have just been put in, but the actual engine itself will sit on the very top here in this area here. But you can see the size of all these lumps and the big crane that was installed in the roof of the building to carry every component into position. And in fact, we still use that crane on a weekly basis because nothing in that building has got any lighter in the last 100 years. They also added an extra chimney. So if any of you noticed the very earlier picture I showed you of the first pumping station at Kempton, it had just one chimney, but they put a second chimney in to accommodate the flue gases from the extra bank of steam boilers that they put in the building that butts onto the back of our museum. They also increased the filtration capacity of the works by putting in a primary filter house. And the way the primary filter house works is it filters out the large dirt and bacteria that are in the water coming from the reservoir before it goes into the slow sand filters. So the slow sand filters get treated as the secondary filter, the after filter, the fine filter, whereas this is the coarse filter. And it can process about 50 million gallons of water a day. And this building is still fully active to this day. And I went in there a few weeks ago with Thames Water to look at what was surviving from the 1920s. And almost everything from the 1920s is still in operation to this very day, except that the brass isn't kept as well polished as it was 80 years ago. This image here shows the engine house just after it had been completed and the scaffolding removed. But you can see the absolute chaos outside where they're still laying all the water mains and finishing it all off. But I think it's quite an impressive photograph to look at. And this is an image showing one of the two triple expansion engines just after it had been finished and they were still shiny and new. This is the Lady Bessie Prescott engine. Out of the two engines we have in the museum, one we can run, the Sir William Prescott engine, but the Lady Bessie Prescott engine is currently undergoing restoration. And hopefully one day it may even look as shiny and as nice as it does in that photograph. Now, because this was such a massive undertaking, the Metropolitan Water Board thought they'd throw a party when they opened the place in 1929. Now, the chairman, Sir William Prescott, who our engine's named after, he had contacted the King and asked whether he could come along and open it up, because he said it was quite a proud moment for the board. And the King and the Queen had 5 years previously opened the Queen Mary Reservoir. Well, unfortunately, the King was ill at the time, and we've actually been through the records, and it's quite amusing because Sir William Prescott starts working his way down the rank of the royal family. He then asks if the Prince and Princess of Wales, the Prince of Wales could come, but later King Edward VIII was busy covering for the King. He then asked the Duke and Duchess of York, later King George VI and the Queen Mother, but they were covering for the Prince of Wales. So in the end he says, OK, what about the Minister of Health? So an invitation goes to Neville Chamberlain. But between the invitation going out and the inauguration in October 1929, there is a general election. And the Conservatives are ousted, and the Labour Party come in for only the second time in history. So they end up with the Right Honourable Arthur Greenwood, Minister of Health, in Ramsay MacDonald's administration. And this is a photograph here, shows the Minister of Health putting the key in the lock of the door to our engine house. And the guy behind him, standing there carrying what looks like an iPhone in his hand, is Henry Stilgo, the chief engineer of the Metropolitan Water Board, the guy who masterminded the whole installation. And in fact, 5 years ago, we celebrated the 90th anniversary of the museum being opened. And we invited Henry Stilgo's grandson back. Henry Stilgo's grandson is Richard Stilgo, the TV personality. And he came back and he read some excerpts from the speech that was made in 1929. Now, between our two engines, you might notice there's quite a large void. It's now taken up by two steam turbines that I'll mention a bit later. But in 1929, it was a perfect banquet space because it was empty. And this is the luncheon that they had on the engine house floor in 1929. You can just spy the bottom of the engine in the background, and there would be one on this side as well. And you can see all the great and the good of London, various mayors and aldermen and chief engineers of various authorities sitting in there dining away. We found that they had food put on by Harrods, they had a brass band in there, all sorts of interesting financial meddling as well, because they couldn't actually justify spending all this money on all this food. So they basically asked the chairman of the board to put it on his own cheque, and then they basically increased his allowance by the exact amount of money just to justify the wine. It's quite amusing. The man in the background, the very short man, that is Sir William Prescott. So the very short man has the largest working steam engine in the world named after him. And then you have the Minister of Health here. Now, this day is a significant day in world history because it's the 24th of October, 1929. I don't know if that means anything to anybody in this room. I'll give you a clue. It was a Thursday. I can hear crash being mentioned. You're right. It's Black Thursday. It's the first day of the Wall Street crash. But, of course, nobody in there would know because this is 11 o'clock in the morning. The stock markets in New York don't open until about 1 or 2 o'clock UK time. So I think of that day as being a sort of a pivotal moment in world history. And if you look at how grand that engine house is and those engines, they're extravagant, they're anachronistic. They could have put electric and diesel pumps in the 1920s, but they decided to go with the big, bold, we'll put the biggest steam engines we can find in this big Portland stone building. But if you look at everything the MWB did after this moment, it's all a bit cheaper and more utilitarian, which sort of suggests that perhaps the focus had shifted and there was less money floating around. So I think of this as being the last day of decadence. And an example of the last days of decadence are that they would put these beautiful engines in. They left a space in between the engines for a third unit. But by 1933, just 5 years later, they said, right, we want to increase the capacity of the works. We'll stick in an extra pumping unit between the two steam engines, but we don't want to put a big triple expansion engine in. We'll put two cheap and nasty, noisy steam turbines, and that's what they did. And this is one of them here. The other one's just out of view, but you may be able to see it here. Here we go. Here's the other unit running at some point in the 1960s. Very noisy things, less efficient. They burned about 10 tonnes more coal a week when they were running a steam turbine. Very noisy, gave lots of the engine crews tinnitus. But they had exactly the same horsepower, 1,008 horsepower as the big steam engines. And in fact, they could pump slightly more water. So the big triple expansion engines could shift about 19 million gallons of water every day. but the turbines could move about 24 million gallons per day. So even though they were more energy consuming, more energy and more coal and noisier, they were slightly more useful. And this photo here shows the boilers that produced all of the steam to drive the triple expansion engines and the steam turbines. So they installed 6 Babcock and Wilcox water tube boilers. And just out of view at the very end, they added in the 1950s 2 boilers made by John Thompson. And now, sadly, all of this kit has been scrapped. When the place was shut down in 1980, they had no use for the engine house and boiler house. So Thames Water just left it alone. But sadly, in the 1990s, they did find a use for the boiler house and the boilers were scrapped. But I'll come back to that a bit later. Now, I mentioned that there was a little narrow gauge railway line to bring in the coal, but there was also a standard gauge railway line. And this photo shows a Planet locomotive hauling coal wagons along this line, which was just opposite the boiler house and the museum building. So you might just see that's the back of the museum building there. And in fact, if you're in the museum and you look just over the road, there is an embankment, and that's where the railway line was located. And trains, coal trains would come down the Shepperton branch of the Southern Railway line, and the coal wagons would be hauled along to this wagon tippler, and they'd be flipped upside down. The coal would then drop into a chute underneath the railway lines, through a tunnel under the road, and it'd be carried into the boiler house through a bucket system into the roof, and then from the roof it would then slide down these slides into the boilers, which had a moving chain grate that would carry the coal through the furnace. And as the coal went through the furnace, it would burn, they'd be turned to ash. And once it was ash, it would then go over the edge of the chain grate into the hoppers, then back out to the railway line and be carted off. So it meant that if you wanted to increase the amount of steam for the machines, you just had to turn the electric motor speed up. So it was a very efficient and not labour-intensive way of doing things. That locomotive was replaced a few years later by a Ruston diesel locomotive, and this photograph shows it basking in the sun just before it was scrapped in the 1960s. Now, one of the pivotal moments in the history of the waterworks was during the Second World War, because they identified that the Kempton Waterworks was of great importance for supplying water for London, not just for drinking and for industry, but also for firefighting. We didn't have the luxury in the 1940s of having bottled water in ample supply. And if the water supply had become contaminated or switched off, there wouldn't have been enough water in reserve for everybody. And the government actually feared that there'd be a refugee crisis where everybody would try and leave London to go into the home counties, and they just wouldn't be able to support everybody. So Kempton Park was earmarked by the government as being the most important pumping station in London, and it must be protected at all costs. And this is a quote from the chief engineer and the ARP officer at the time. So the MWB put together the air raid precautions to try and protect the works. And this shows Kempton in 1939 being dressed for battle. If you look at the windows, you'll see that they've been covered in steel blast shutters to prevent any shrapnel from penetrating the glass. They bricked up all of the entrances that they didn't feel they needed to use, sandbagged the rest. They put anti-aircraft gunners in the grounds. They had their own battalion of the Home Guard there. They put barbed wire everywhere. There was even talk about putting steam jets on the gates to blast steam to any intruders should they come in, which I think is a bit extreme myself. But there's all sorts of talks about the things that they did in the plan. And this photograph here shows some of the damage that the Metropolitan Water Board experienced during the Second World War. This crater here near Moorgate Tube Station shows the sort of damage that they were having to deal with. Because if a bomb landed in the middle of the road, it would rupture the water mains. And in one night, in May 1941, they lost 605 water mains in one night. But I looked at the records, almost all of them were repaired and functioning again within 2 weeks, which I think is an amazing achievement. But during the course of the war, they lost 6,635 water mains through enemy action. Now, one of the worst disasters was the Balham Tube Station disaster, and I'm sure probably a lot of you are familiar with this photograph of the bus in the crater. Now, 60 people were killed in that incident in the tube station and 70 injured. But most of them weren't killed by the impact of the bomb, the explosion, or the debris falling in. A lot of them were killed by the impact of being hit by the water coming out of the water mains that are just hidden behind the tram lines there, hitting them in the tunnel. So if you didn't drown, you died by the force of the water hitting you. So it was a terrible, terrible moment. And this diagram here shows the effect on water consumption during the Second World War. And you might notice these spikes here are the 3 worst nights of the Blitz. And it shows that on some nights, London went through an extra 100 million gallons of water in one night to either put out the fires or through the leaks from the water mains being ruptured under the ground. That night there, the 29th of December 1940, is the night that was famously depicted on the front of the, I think, the Daily Mail of St Paul's Cathedral, surrounded by smoke and fire. That was that night. And they all tally with nights when it was a full moon and the River Thames is at its lowest level. The firefighters weren't able to rely upon the suction of water from the river because it was too low to do it. So they had to use the mains water if they could, hence why so much was consumed. Now, in order to protect Kempton from air attack, the chief engineer wanted to have barrage balloons. These are quotes from the archive records. He wanted to have barrage balloons put up because he feared that enemy aircraft might target the pumping station. But the RAF wouldn't have any of it. They said, no, it will interfere with our own aircraft trying to fly into Hamworth Aerodrome, Heathrow and Brooklands. And anyway, don't worry, we don't think the Luftwaffe are going to target any of your waterworks. And he did go on to say they can't be seen very easily from the air. And there is another letter which I've not included from the chief engineer saying, you're wrong, they're all surrounded by massive bodies of reflective water, they've all got chimneys, they stick up like a sore thumb, please reconsider. But Squadron Leader Slightfoot, he was having none of it, and he said no. But the ironic thing is, 2 months later, in Berlin, the Germans put together a 5-page target file for Kempton Waterworks, and this is 1 page from the 5-page document, which is now kept at the Imperial War Museum at Duxford. And I must admit, when I was doing some research a few years ago, when I found this, I thought, that's a good find. It talks about how to get to Kempton by rail from Waterloo in German. It talks about what the roof's made from, what the building's doing, the fact it has 2 chimneys, etc. And this is one of the excerpts. I think that's pretty clear that that was pretty much a target at some point when it says name of the objective. And it was given the target number GB 53-8, GB being Great Britain, 53 being waterworks, and 8 meaning that it was the 8th one that they'd surveyed. And you can see, consisting of the power plant with 2 chimney stones and the pump house in modern construction. And here are 2 other pages from that same report with a red outline all the way around the works, showing exactly where it is and what it was doing. And it's funny to note that they took this picture from the engineering magazine as well, without crediting it. Now, fortunately, it didn't get hit, but it did come very close. This photo here shows the damage caused by a V2 rocket, which landed just across the road from the pumping station and landed in the old East London Waterworks, which was across the road from it. And it put a rather large crater in the middle of the filter beds. And we do have stories of other bombs falling in the vicinity of the works. And in fact, one was found in the 1980s in the reservoirs by a fisherman who was over there fishing, and it was a dry summer, and apparently the water level had fallen down to the silt level, and he could just see what looked like the tail fins of a bomb sticking out of the mud. And he called the manager. The manager got onto an area manager, and the area manager told me the story. He went down there, got his binoculars out, looked out across the reservoir, and he could see that there were the tail fins of a bomb. But he noticed that there were footprints going out and there were footprints coming back. So he turned around to the filter bed labourers and he said, has one of you been out there to that bomb? And this guy went, oh yeah, I went out there. He said, it's got a little propeller on the back, but it won't spin round. And apparently they got the bomb and they took it away and blew it up somewhere else. But so post-war, the place carried on serving its purpose, pumping London's drinking water. And this is one of the photographs showing how pristine the place was kept right up until the day it closed. You can see your face in pretty much every single surface of the engine. And it had some fame. So if any of you have ever seen Chitty Chitty Bang Bang, it played the part of Scrumptious' Sweet Factory. So you have a scene where Cracticus Potts rides up on his bike with the kids. They go into the building on the right, and then you see all the dogs jumping in and out of the windows. I've watched the film several times and confirmed they are jumping in and out of the windows of the waterworks. And I mentioned earlier that a lot of Titanic films get made there as well, because we have the engines that are very similar to Titanic. And in the 1970s, the Metropolitan Water Board ceased to exist. Thames Water Authority came into power, and they amalgamated the sewer waste system and the water supply system into one organisation. So by the 1960s, the old Lilleshall pumping engines that were in the building behind our museum, they were getting on a bit. So Thames Water scrapped them and replaced those engines with 5 electric spindle pumps, and they started commissioning those in the late 1970s. And of course, by the late 1970s, our big engines were beginning to get on themselves. They were approaching the end of their 50-year life. Electric motors were the way forward, and they were getting concerned that they wouldn't be able to find the spare parts for a 62-foot-high triple expansion engine in the late 1980s. So they thought it was prudent to remove the old kit and put these modern electric pumps in, which meant that by 1980, our engines were decommissioned, and this photograph was taken in November 1980, showing dignitaries from Thames Water at the controls of the engine, turning it off for the very last time. Now, fortunately, they didn't need the building, so the engines survived, and in fact, even in the 1980s, they were saying, well, they might be of interest in a few years' time. It would cost a lot to get rid of them. We'll just leave them. And likewise, they left the boiler plant. But by 1993, Thames Water had decided that actually the boiler plant was taking up a lot of room and that they wanted to put some extra equipment in there. So sadly, they scrapped all of the original coal-fired boilers in the 1990s. And these photographs here show the building being hollowed out to a complete shell. By the 1990s, after they'd removed the boilers, the engines were looking a bit tired. I showed you how beautiful they were looking in the earlier photograph. This is what they were looking like by 1995. Rusty, covered in dirt, the pigeons had got in, the windows had been blown out. It was all looking a bit sorry for itself. And this is the engine just a few years later, and you can see the flywheels have rusted over, the paint's flaking off. The glass on the lamp standards had been smashed. It was all looking rather sad. So fortunately, in 1997, Thames Water gave the Kempton Great Engines Trust, who I'm a trustee of, a 99-year lease to look after the engines, the building, get the engines running again, and to tell the story of London's water supply. And this photo shows some of the volunteers in the early 2000s on top of the Sir William Prescott engine. And in 2002, we asked this chap to come along and get the engine started. You may recognise him. He came along, and where Sir William Prescott had failed to get the King in the 1920s, we succeeded 20 years ago to get the Prince of Wales, and now King Charles, to start the Sir William Prescott engine. And the building has been open to the public now for 20 years, as of March this year, to the public. Now, I mentioned that the boiler house was gutted in the 1990s. Now, one of our big projects going forward as a museum is to try and see if we can get this building back, because it butts onto the back of the engine house. It's part of the same building. All they've done is they've bricked up the doorways that link the two together. Now, the equipment that Thames Water put in there in 1993, they have since stopped using. It's sitting there redundant. It's decaying. So we've put it to Thames that we'd quite like to remove the modern equipment they put in there, get the space back, and then we can increase our museum facilities, put in a lecture hall just like this, fun enough, exactly what we're envisaging, improving all of our facilities, etc. And we have got an artist impression here of something that we'd possibly like to do in there. So we thought about trying to rescue another steam engine from the New River. That's the Turnford engine on the New River up in Hertfordshire. And trying to just increase the space that we have available, because at the moment we've got the beautiful engine house, but that's all we have. We're trying to cram all our facilities into this one space. So we're thinking that that'd be quite a nice opportunity for us going forward. So stay tuned to that project. But I thought I'd end on that image, as it's relevant to here. So every now and again we run a Route Master shuttle service from sometimes the London Museum of Water and Steam, other times from Twickenham Railway Station. So go onto our website and you should better hear about it. But that's all from me. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Stephen. Wonderfully illustrated and a very, very well thought through talk. Very, very interesting. I'm sure everybody agrees with me. We have got a few minutes for questions if anybody's interested. Any questions? Jim's got the microphone. I think you filled in
Oh, that's good.
all the gaps. I will ask one. You talked about the old waterworks opposite. Was that Hanworth?
Yeah, the Hanworth Road Works. So that was, I think I forgot to mention actually, it was built in 1872 and it supplied the East End of London with drinking water. But it's, you should be seeing it now, hopefully. That functioned right from the 1870s up until the 1930s with those 3 beam engines. But they scrapped those engines after the Second World War because there was a shortage of metal at the time. And sadly, that beautiful Italianate standpipe tower was also felled. That tower was such a local landmark that for many years it was on the brass dial on Richmond Hill. So if you looked out into the distance, it would be the tallest structure you could see for miles. And you do see it in the background of a lot of postcards and various things as being this little stick on the horizon. But yeah, sadly that's all been lost.
But there's also a pumping works at Hampton.
Hampton, yeah.
Hampton.
Yeah, so there's a let me find it. So this chart here shows all of the waterworks in the area. So Hampton is in the middle here. That's a still fully active waterworks, as is Kempton Park, except what's in our museum building, and that supplies a lot of the west of London. So I live in Twickenham, that supplies the drinking water for where I live. And in fact, if any of you live in that area of London, you lost your drinking water on Christmas Day 2016, yes. You're getting your water from Hampton Waterworks because apparently there was a power failure and the pumps went off. And that's why we didn't have any water.
And can the different waterworks provide backup for each other?
They can. There's intercommunication between them. So Kempton can pump water for Hampton, and likewise Hampton can do Kempton. And Ashford Common Works, which is just next to the Queen Mary Reservoir, that also has interconnections as well. Mm. And during 2020, because of the COVID pandemic, central London was so empty of people that actually Kempton Park Works didn't have a lot of demand. And they shut it down for 6 months, which was the first time in its history it was taken offline. And what little water was needed in central London just to keep perhaps Trafalgar Square fountains just ticking over, all came from Ashford Common Works. But it was really quite eerie because the whole works just went silent for 6 months and the engineers said they'd never seen anything like it. But it was only because of the pandemic that they were able to do that in its 100-year life.
You mentioned Kew Bridge Works. Now that is just purely a museum now?
That's purely a museum. So when the Grand Junction Waterworks had to move their intake from Chelsea, from the Dolphin, they moved to Kew Bridge. And then they carried on doing exactly the same thing they did at Chelsea. They just sucked the water out of the River Thames at Kew and put it straight into the water supply system. But after the Act of Parliament came along that they needed to filter it, what they did was they built the works at Hampton, and then they pumped the water from the River Thames at Hampton to Kew Bridge, then filtered it at Kew Bridge and then put it into supply. But by the 1940s, they didn't really need to use Kew Bridge as much anymore, and then by the 1970s or 80s, they shut it down completely, and now it is purely just a museum.
Sure. Thank you very much. Oh, yeah.
When we open? The 16th and 17th of March is the next steaming date. If you go onto our website, we've got a whole calendar of events. So we're normally open on the 3rd weekend of every month. The 3rd weekend of every month normally is a rule of thumb. But we try and keep ourselves secret. Yeah. We're at Kempton, we're a 100% volunteer-run organisation, so we tend to just open up on about 9 weekends a year when we get the big engine running. So we tend to consolidate all our efforts into those steaming days. Though between March and November, we do open for static viewing every Sunday if we can, and that's when 3 or 4 of us will go in and we just show people around, so you can get in then. It's a gas-fired boiler we use now, so we've got I should have had a picture of it. We've got I say modern, it's 25 years old now, but a boiler made by Cochrane, a subsidiary of Rolls-Royce. and it's like a brewery boiler. It's very small, very efficient, computer controlled, turns itself on and off. We hardly have to do anything to it, and that supplies all the steam we need. And in fact, because our engine is no longer shifting 19 million gallons of water 12 miles to Hampstead, it's just idling. It uses very little steam. When it was in service days, it'd run on 200 psi, whereas now, sometimes the needle hardly moves off the stop. It's sort of ticking over about £5 per square inch, the engines. You see, 120 tonnes of moving metal ticking over less than a bicycle tyres of pressure. It's quite amazing.
I was just going to ask about the tower to get the pressure. Is that what one of the chimneys is for at your works?
No. The chimney's purely a flue for removing the gas, the exhaust gases from the boilers. The tower at Hanworth Road, though, was a dual. Let me try and find it. It served a dual purpose. So it was a chimney and a standpipe tower combined. So it was broken into thirds. So there was an empty shaft that did nothing. There was a chimney shaft. You can see the opening at the top there. And then there was another section that had the iron pipe that rose up, and then the iron pipe that came back down again. The one at Brentford, at Kew Bridge, that is purely a standpipe tower. They had a separate chimney, which is depicted in this picture here. So you can see the little chimney at the back and then the standpipe tower at the front. Only the standpipe tower now survives at Kew Bridge. But the idea is that the head pressure that the pumps have to deliver the water at is always the same, because the tower never gets higher or lower. So even if the demand increases, it doesn't suddenly make the engines speed up and hit the blocks and break themselves.
Very quickly.
Oh,
Can you
hi.
tell me what they do with the sand?
Sand. They clean it. So what they do, they skim the top layer of sand off about once a month, and they take it to the cleaning facility that's on site, and they clean it with clean water. It's a very circular process, and they let it settle, and they sort of skim the sort of you get like a sludge that comes off the surface, and that gets taken off to be treated elsewhere, and then the sand gets reapplied. I don't know how much sand they eventually get through, because I'd imagine some gets lost in the process, but it does get cleaned.
London's growing at a tremendous rate. Will there come a time when the present capacity of the current system runs out, and where then will you get your water from?
Wow, it's a good question, isn't it? I mean, that's a problem I think they're starting to battle with now, really, because the system hasn't really increased for quite some time. I mean, there's talk about building new reservoirs in places like Oxford to carry water into London, but there's a lot of politics around that. But yeah, I mean, they're trying to take more and more water out of the River Thames. At Teddington, for instance, you may have heard of the Teddington River Abstraction Plan. That's quite a contentious subject in the part of London I live in at the moment. But it is a big problem going forward, because we will eventually run out of water in London, because we're getting drier and drier summers, so there's less water in the Thames, and we're also increasing in number, and we're also using more water per head. So I think going forward we're going to have to make some difficult decisions about the way we use water and how much we use of it. But you're right, it will have to be increased as the century progresses.
I believe at one time there were proposals for linking all the water boards with a ring main type system.
It's
Did
like a
that
national
ever
grid.
get anywhere?
I don't know anything about that. I've heard of it. They call it like a national grid for water, because there's a lot of water in the northeast. It'd be great to tap into that, but I don't know how that would work from an engineering perspective. I know that Thames Water have published on their website several plans going forward, including trying to tap water from the far west of England, and try and connect up various rivers and using the canals. But I'm afraid that's all I know, really. I know more about the past than the future.
Any other questions? Well, in that case, then I'll again thank Stephen very, very much for coming tonight. I found it particularly interesting. I do know the area quite well. I live out that way. And I would just say, as you go down towards Sunbury, having passed the Metropolitan Water Board building, there are a number of canisters, huge. Is that part of the filtration system?
Yeah, see, the ones you're probably looking at would be... are you talking about these things here? The beds?
No.
Over here?
Steel.
Oh, blue things?
Yeah.
I know what you mean, yeah.
Silos.
They're silos. I think they're part of the nature reserve.
Oh.
Because there are two reservoirs over the back that are no longer used, but one of them's a nature reserve, and I believe they store rainwater in them.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I believe that's what they're for.
Oh, I thought they were part of the filtration system.
No. Not to the best of my knowledge, anyway. No, that to the right of the building is all just scrubland and fields for potential future expansion of the.
Well,
of the
there
of the
has
works.
been talk about developing Kempton Park Racecourse for housing. How will that affect the waterworks in any way? Apart from taking water,
Yeah.
how will it?
Well, hopefully it wouldn't. It won't affect the waterworks because that's a protected site and it's on different land. But
okay.
it would certainly put a lot more people under
Very much
on our doorstep. But I understand that there are problems trying to change it from its current use, which is good. So I think it has to remain a racecourse for the time
For
being.
a few more years.
Yeah, that's my understanding.
Okay, thank you. Well, indeed, thank you very much. I wish everybody a safe journey home and look forward to seeing you all next month. Thank you.
Go on.
Talking to Dave Downs, Trustee CEO of Temple at Crossness.
Oh yeah.
In that hot summer, it was taking 2 weeks from the sewage to get from Kingston to Deptford.
Was it?
And it's getting foul by the time they got there, and another week from Deptford to Crossness. What they wanted to do